The state has always been the instrument by which one social class rules over other social classes. When a state changes its outward features, when one political regime yields to another, the first thought that comes to mind is, what is going on behind the scenes? Is a new class coming into power? But when a number of unequivocal signs indicate that it is the same class in the saddle, the question instead becomes, what interests of the ruling class are served by this upheaval? Up until now, the political system in most of the advanced industrial states was so-called democracy, pseudo-democracy, that is, parliamentary democracy, not direct democracy, bourgeois democracy, not proletarian democracy, adulterated democracy, not pure democracy. On close examination, it often even turns out to be half-breed Caesarism, but on the whole, even today, one may say is the most usual political form in the advanced countries. In two great Western European powers, Italy and Germany, democracy has been superseded by a new political system quite different from democracy, namely fascism. Because it first appeared in Italy, this new system is usually given an Italian name, but it is by no means specifically Italian. The problem it poses is universal. Since the rise of capitalism, the dominant bourgeoisie has considered democracy the most desirable political system. Now, in two countries, and those by no means the least important, the bourgeoisie has changed its mind. Why? Revolutionaries have a perfectly natural tendency to see everything as it relates to themselves. They are under the impression that the bourgeoisie resorts to fascism only to smash the imminent threat of proletarian revolution. There is a certain grain of truth in this explanation, but it is oversimplified. The wealthy certainly fear revolution and finance bands of gangsters to teach the workers good manners, but it is not so much to stifle the revolution that they hand state power over to the fascists. Neither in Italy nor in Germany was revolution in the offing at the moment fascism took state power. The bourgeoisie resorts to fascism less in response to disturbances in the street than in response to disturbances in their own economic system. The sickness they aim to banish is within, not without. The keystone of capitalism is profit. As long as capitalism was growing, the bourgeoisie was able to tap ever new sources of profit through the ceaseless development of production and the constant expansion of domestic and foreign markets. After the First World War, capitalism as a whole began to decline. To the periodic economic crises of the past, there had been added a chronic crisis involving the whole system and threatening capitalist profit at its very source. Up to the war, democracy suited capitalism perfectly. Everyone knows the old refrain, democracy is the cheapest form of government. The spirit of free enterprise can flower only in the benign climate of liberty. The political rights which democracy grants to the masses act as a sort of safety valve and prevent violent clashes between rulers and ruled. Democracy enlarges the capitalist market by encouraging the masses to want more goods and by giving them, to an extent, the means of satisfying their needs. All true enough, when the feast is abundant, the people may safely be allowed to pick up the crumbs. In the present period of capitalist decline, however, the ruling class is impelled to put democracy into the scales, carefully weighing its advantages against its drawbacks. Like Buridan's ass, it eyes the two bundles of hay and hesitates, a cruel dilemma. In certain countries and under certain conditions, the drawbacks seem to outweigh the advantages. For on this point it is not yet certain that the bourgeoisie has correctly calculated its own interests. Time alone will tell. When the economic crisis becomes acute, when the rate of profit sinks towards zero, the bourgeoisie can see only one way to restore its profits. It empties the pockets of the people down to the last centime. It resorts to what M. Callot, once finance minister of France, expressly calls the Great Penance: brutal slashing of wages and social expenditures, raising of tariff duties at the expense of the consumer, etc. The state, furthermore, rescues business enterprises on the brink of bankruptcy, forcing the masses to foot the bill. Such enterprises are kept alive with subsidies, tax exemptions, orders for public works, and armaments. In short, the state thrusts itself into the breach left by the vanishing private customers. But such manoeuvres are difficult under a democratic regime. As long as democracy survives, the masses, though thoroughly deceived and plundered, have some means of defence against the great penance. Freedom of the press, universal suffrage, the right to organise into unions and to strike, etc. Feeble defences, it is true, but still capable of setting some limit to the insatiable demands of the money power. In particular, the resistance of the organised working class makes it rather difficult to simply lower wages. And so, in certain countries and under certain conditions, the bourgeoisie throws its traditional democracy overboard and conjures up with its invocations and its subsidies that strong state which alone can strip the masses of all means of defence, tying their hands behind their backs, the better to empty their pockets. The phrase "in certain countries under certain conditions" is important. These are those nations which have put in their claim for a place in the sun too late, and so find themselves lacking raw materials and markets. In richer, more fortunate countries, the bourgeoisie seems to have succeeded not in escaping the crisis permanently, but at least in extricating itself for the time being from its difficulties. They have been able to start up again, after a fashion, the mechanism of profit, resorting to expedients which at least have not required the substitution of dictatorship for democracy. But they use basically the same methods in both cases. The state refloated private capitalism, revived it with great public works and huge defence contracts. But thanks to the wealth accumulated by preceding generations, in the latter case there was no need for the fascist club to empty the workers' pockets. In the USA, for example, Roosevelt's New Deal sufficed. It is not enough to say that the bourgeoisie in certain countries like Italy and Germany financed fascism and brought it to power for the above reasons. That would be imprecise. Contrary to common belief, the capitalist bourgeoisie is not completely homogeneous. To any general threat against its class interests, it presents a face of granite, but in less crucial matters, the rock betrays deep fissures. Each capitalist group, in defending its own economic interests, comes into conflict with the interests of other capitalist groups. It is quite true that such groups are closely interrelated and that the lines of demarcation are not always very sharp, but this by no means prevents the existence of violent conflicts of interest. And so, it is important to ask whether, in Italy and in Germany, fascism was invoked and subsidised by the bourgeoisie as a whole, or by certain particular groups of capitalists. Since the various bourgeois political parties are simply the mirrors, or rather the tools, of the various capitalist groups, unless one knows the attitude of these groups towards fascism, it is impossible to understand the shifting, complex and puzzling interplay of political parties in the period which precedes fascism's seizure of power. This chapter will show that fascism, in Italy and Germany alike, has been subsidised above all by the magnates of heavy industry, such as iron, steel and mining, and by bankers with a stake in heavy industry. Let us anticipate for a moment the conclusion we shall later draw. The detailed and objective study of fascism in Italy and Germany will show clearly that the heavy industrialists, the big businessmen, are the chief, and one might even say the only, beneficiaries of the fascist dictatorship. But to return to our analysis, why in the early stages are the heavy industrialists almost alone in subsidising and egging on the fascist movement? Why are other capitalist groups, and those notably which may be lumped under the heading of light industry or finished goods industry, why are they in the beginning non-committal and sometimes even hostile towards the growing fascist movement? One does not have to go to Italy and Germany to observe that heavy and light industry do not have the same economic interests and do not use the same social and political strategy. Conflicts are constantly breaking out between the two groups. Light industry often complains about the overlordship of heavy industry, which makes it pay through the nose for raw materials and machines. In foreign policy, heavy industry, living in great part off munitions orders originating in its native state as well as in friendly powers, is characteristically for a policy of prestige, force and imperialistic adventure. Light industry, however, interested in exporting non-military products, has nothing much to gain from war or from autarky. Besides, it is much more closely tied up with international capitalism and international finance than heavy industry. It favours, therefore, a policy of international collaboration. In dealing with labour, heavy and light industry usually rely on quite different methods. The chiefs of steel and mining enterprises are noted for their authoritarian attitude, their tough boss psychology. Their will to power is explained by the vast scope of their enterprises and the dominant role they play in the economy and in the state. But the explanation must also be sought in what Marx calls the organic composition of the capital invested in their enterprises. The ratio of fixed capital invested in plant, raw materials, etc., to variable capital, i.e. wages, is much higher in heavy than light industry. The result is that the limits within which production is profitable are especially narrow in heavy industry. Whenever the steelmasters are unable to run their works at a sufficiently high percentage of capacity, the fixed charges, interest, depreciation, on their plants are distributed over an insufficiently large quantity of products and profits are impaired. When a strike breaks out, the least stoppage of production means losses amounting into the millions. If the economic crisis sharpens, they are unable to cut their fixed costs and can only reduce their wage bill. Brutal wage cuts are for them an imperious necessity. The light industrialists follow a rather different labour policy. The organic composition of their capital is lower, their fixed costs less burdensome, their arrogance less overpowering. Furthermore, the fact that they produce goods for consumption makes them fear that the too brutal measures of deflation demanded by heavy industry during a period of crisis will have a disastrous effect on the purchasing power of the masses, that is to say, of their consumers. So most of them prefer, in place of strong arm tactics, what they call class collaboration and industrial peace, and what is actually only a more hypocritical and insidious way of taming and corrupting the proletariat. It is then hardly surprising that in Italy and Germany, heavy and light industry should have looked on the growth of fascism with quite different feelings. Heavy industry wanted to pursue the class struggle until the proletariat was crushed. Light industry still believed everything could be patched up by industrial peace and political horse trading. Heavy industry called for a dynamic foreign policy. Light industry leaned towards a policy of internal cooperation. Heavy industry wanted to strengthen its economic hegemony with the aid of a dictatorial state, which should be its state. Light industry feared this development. But the point cannot be too strongly underlined. The capitalist groups in light industry put up no serious resistance to fascism. They did not want its triumph, its totalitarian dictatorship, but they did nothing effective to block its progress. Why not? First, because fascism was a national movement, that is to say, in the service of the owning class and deserving by this token the sympathy or at least the tolerance of all property owners. Again, because they did not think a totalitarian fascist dictatorship was possible. They saw fascism as just one more political movement which they could manipulate and even make use of. And so in both countries, liberal politicians closely connected to the light industry groups temporised with fascism. Faithful to their customary tactics of industrial peace and political jockeying, they imagined that once it was housebroken and parliamentarised, fascism would serve as a useful counterweight to the forces of the proletariat. They succeeded only in putting it into the saddle. And on that day, when fascism, to their amazement, had become a considerable political force in its own right, a popular movement which could no longer be checked without the use of armed force, light industry and its liberal politicians put class loyalty ahead of the conflict of interests. They were loath to shed the blood of patriots. They resigned themselves to the triumph of fascism. The entire capitalist class united to put fascism into power. This should be a warning to those anti-fascists who think they can rely not on themselves but on left-wing capitalism, on the liberal bourgeoisie to block fascism's road to power. We shall see in detail, first in Italy and then in Germany, according to the scheme of this book, what the various capitalist groups thought of fascism. For clarity's sake, this analysis will be presented in two parts. 1. At first, it does not occur to big business to launch fascism towards the conquest of power. Business uses its hired fascist gangs for nothing more than anti-labour militia. After the First World War, in the two countries under consideration, it was necessary to make important concessions to the working class in order to avoid a real social revolution. Determined to take back these concessions someday, big business had the quite original idea of entrusting to armed militarised gangs the task of harassing the organised proletariat and smashing its resistance. The great landed proprietors joined in the game. They drew their income from the unlimited exploitation of the rural proletariat, and they too had been forced to make concessions and were anxious to regain the ground they had lost. Their backers assigned another task to the armed bands of Mussolini and Hitler. After the war, Italy and Germany found themselves in the position of powers that were either conquered or humiliated, in contrast to the great satisfied powers. Hungry for munitions orders, the heavy industrialists subsidised the fight against so-called unjust treaties, and they used the fascist gangs to carry on the fight over the heads of the legal governments. 2. But as soon as a serious economic crisis threatened to destroy its profits, and a strong state alone seemed able to make its enterprises profitable again, big business decided to go a step further and launch its fascist troops towards the conquest of political power. With their aid, big business moved to set up a new kind of dictatorship. If you want to read more on this subject, then I recommend reading Fascism and Big Business by Daniel Guerin, which is available for free online on the Libcom website. I would also recommend reading Roger Griffin on this subject as well. Thank you for listening, everyone. All the best.